Here's another little Cold War story. I call it of atom bombs and chocolate bars. A little over a decade after I was introduced in the second grade to the threat of nuclear holocaust, I worked as a cave guide at Ruby Falls, Lookout Mountain Caverns near Chattanooga. One day, Toonie Smith, who dispatched the guides, called up to the guides' waiting room and asked if anyone wanted to go volunteer to go down in the cave and pick up trash. I guess he meant me, since it was late afternoon in winter and only myself and one other guide, David Mason, were working, and Dave had a small tour in the cave. I was tired of dealing with tourists anyway and did not want to take another tour. I figured I could stretch this out till closing time. Picking up trash in the cave was not much work, mostly collecting cigarette butts and the occasional paper cup. Yep, folks, believe it or not, in 1968, people were allowed to smoke hundreds of feet underground in a narrow cave corridor a mile long with practically no air circulation. By the time 3,000 people had passed through the cave on a summer day, a fog of cigarette smoke hung in the air down to about head height. In winter, it was not that bad, and I managed to pick up the butts and get back to the falls and to the elevator in about 30 minutes. I still had 30 minutes to kill before getting off, so I slipped into the darkness of the undeveloped part of the cave. Since it was unlighted and considered relatively unsafe, it was supposed to be off limits, but, rules never meant much to me. I'd been in the unimproved area a few times looking for the reported crawlway along the small stream that ran from the waterfalls through the cave. It was supposed to lead to a natural exit. It was a guide's legend, but no one I knew had ever seen it. The only entrance or exit I knew of was the elevator shaft that had been sunk through 260 feet of solid limestone from the surface. As I was poking around, I noticed an odd reflection in my flashlight beam from the rock shelf just above my head. Looking more closely, I realized the reflection was from a highly rusted yellow and black civil defense placard. I knew immediately that this meant the cave was a designated public atomic fallout shelter. My first thought was, how stupid. I was well acquainted with sitting around in the dark, waiting for the power to come back on when thunderstorms knocked out the electricity. Not only was it totally dark in the cave, but the elevator didn't run without power. The idea of being stuck 260 feet underground with no way to get out in a nuclear attack was both stupid and downright creepy. I was considering this, and I thought I saw something in the flashlight under the rock shelf. As I bent down, I saw what appeared to be some kind of moldy fabric. Duck walking closer, I found it was a canvas tarp covering something about 4 feet high and 20 feet long. I pulled up the edge and saw yellow and black civil defense markings on a small, rusted metal canister about half the size of a 55-gallon drum. As I discovered this, I heard Dave returning to the elevator with the last tour of the day. I hurried back to meet them and rode up with him and his small tour. Back on the surface, we were locking up and clocking out. I told Dave about my find and asked if he ever heard anything about the falls being a fallout shelter. He said no. I asked if he wanted to check it out, and he replied, "Do you think we should? What do you think it is?" I said it was probably emergency supplies, and it would probably be all right. Besides, I doubted anyone had checked on it in years, and probably no one even knew it was there. By 1968, the peak of the hysteria over nuclear Armageddon was over. It had been more than a half a decade since I'd even heard mention of civil defense. Everyone but us had gone home, and I said, let's check it out. The lights in the cave were on a timer, so it was dark when we got off the elevator, but our 3-cell flashlights proved adequate light. The storage area was probably less than 150 feet from the elevator. We ducked under the ledge and started to drag the tarp over the cans. It was wet, moldy, and very heavy with the high humidity in the cave. It was a struggle to raise it in our bent position. Finally, we got one end clear and successfully rolled one of the drums off the top of the pile. Fortunately, it was not too heavy. We decided to see if we could get it open. Examining the lid, we determined that it had small tabs turned down around the circumference, which served as friction locks on the drum edge. It was clear that the tabs were firmly rusted to the barrel. After his initial reluctance, Dave was now fully committed to solving our mystery and offered to go back up to the surface and retrieve some tools. I said, great, and would wait right there. Maybe 10 minutes passed before he returned with a claw hammer, a large standard screwdriver, and a pair of slip joint pliers. Dave held the light and pliers while I drove the screwdriver tip under the tabs. As I broke each tab loose, Dave turned it up with the pliers. We slowly rotated the slippery drum around, trying to avoid cutting ourselves on the sharp, rusty tabs. With all the tabs turned up, Dave attempted to open the lid by pulling with all his strength with the pliers on a tab, which immediately broke off with no sign of movement in the lid. The tabs were brittle with rust, and the lid firmly rusted to the lip of the drum. Despite the 58-degree temperature in the cave, we were sweating, had been at this for more than an hour, and were more than a little frustrated. Dave said he was tired and going home. I responded that after all this trouble, I was damned if I was going to give up. I told him to help me rotate the drum one more time. Finally, I saw what appeared to be a slight indentation in the rust where I might get a purchase with the tip of the screwdriver. I inserted the tip and gave the screwdriver a hard lick, and a small crack in the rust appeared. Again, we worked our way around the perimeter, slowly extending the crack in the rust. Despite several tries, the top did not give until we completely worked our way around again. We pried the lid up and found the drum was completely filled with small wax-coated boxes. The contents were clearly printed on the boxes: canned potted meat, saltine crackers, dried fruit bar, sugar cookie, instant coffee, and a chocolate bar. The list of contents appeared to be very similar to the C rations issued to soldiers in combat during World War II and the Korean War. Opening the box, we found that the saltines were in a plastic pack of 4, coffee in a paper packet, potted meat in a can with a pull tab. The fruit bar, sugar cookie were in wax paper, and the chocolate bar was sealed in aluminum foil. I pulled the tab on the can of meat and smelled the contents. It smelled all right, but it did not look in any way appetizing. I offered it to Dave and just rolled his eyes. I made the comment that the chocolate bar was probably the only thing worth eating, and Dave nodded in assent. Tearing the foil package open, I was immediately struck with the rich smell of milk chocolate. The candy was unmarked, about 1/4 of an inch thick, and about 2.5 by 3 inches. I figured it was probably made by Hershey because they had made them for the soldiers in World War II, perfecting a formula that kept them unmelted and stable until they were ready to eat. I broke off a piece to hand to Dave. He shook his head no and asked what the white film was on the surface of the bar. I said the chocolate was perfectly okay, that it was something that happened to chocolate over time, and it was called a fat bloom. A small amount of fat would work its way to the surface where it crystallized. It had no effect on the quality or taste of the chocolate. We opened a couple of other boxes and ate the chocolate with relish. After we finished the chocolate, we tossed the remains of the box contents back in the drum, which we closed up and rolled under the shelf. We drew the tarp back over the stack of drums and headed back to the elevator. I told Dave that since we were not supposed to be in that part of the cave, it might be best if we did not mention our adventure to anyone. He agreed and took the elevator back up, and we went home. Dave graduated from college that spring and went on to better things. I continued as a guide for 3 more years. We never talked about the catch of civil defense rations again, and I do not know if he ever revisited the chocolate treasure trove. I, on the other hand, made sporadic raids on the drum we originally opened when I was struck with a irresistible chocolate craving. In the course of those 3 years, I'm pretty sure I consumed all the chocolate in the drum. The Cold War ended and the threat of nuclear holocaust diminished. Fallout shelters, if they'd ever made any sense, became obsolete. I have no idea what ultimately happened to the Ruby Falls Fallout Shelter provisions. 20 years later, I took my family on a tour of the falls. The area around the elevator had changed, and a new emergency exit extended through the previously undeveloped area to the outside. Our little guide had no idea what a civil defense fallout shelter was and had never heard of the provision stockpile. Well, that was the end. Suddenly, though, I'm having a craving for Hershey's milk chocolate bar. Thank you.